The Armenian Genocide stands out as a tragedy of unspeakable horror of the 20th century, involving the systematic killing of an estimated 1.1 million Armenians. Armenia is a small nation located on the crossroads of Europe and Asia, making it a place of great strategic importance. For centuries, larger empires fought to control its lands. By the late 19th century, Armenia was split into two regions: Western Armenia, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, and Eastern Armenia, controlled by the Russian Empire. Under Ottoman rule, Armenians were part of a system known as dhimmi, which applied to non-Muslim communities. As Christians in a predominantly Muslim empire, Armenians were granted limited protection but faced many restrictions. They had to pay higher taxes, had fewer legal rights, and were barred from holding certain jobs or positions of power. This unequal treatment made Armenians vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Despite these challenges, Armenians managed to build a strong community. They excelled in trade, craftsmanship, and education, and many Armenians became successful merchants, artisans, and professionals. Their success, however, created resentment among some Ottoman leaders and elites. Armenians began to be seen as a middleman minority, a term used to describe groups that often thrive economically but are socially marginalized. Similar patterns of resentment have been seen in history, such as the treatment of Jews in Europe. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, losing territory and power to European nations. In response, a new wave of ethnic nationalism began to grow within the empire. Ethnic Turks, who saw themselves as the core of the Ottoman identity, wanted to create a more unified and pure Turkish state. Non-Turkish groups, like the Armenians, were increasingly viewed as outsiders and threats to this vision. Armenians who were culturally distinct and mostly Christian became targets of suspicion and hostility. This combination of economic envy, religious differences, and rising nationalism created a dangerous environment for Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw mass killings and policies that targeted Armenians, laying the groundwork for the atrocities to come. Sultan Abdul Hamid II ruled the Ottoman Empire during a time of great internal trouble. The empire was weakening, losing wars, and facing economic hardships. To distract from these problems and maintain control, the Sultan turned Armenians into scapegoats, blaming them for the empire's decline. Between 1894 and 1896, what became known as the Hamidian massacres took place. Armenians in regions like Sassoon, Trabzon, and Diyarbakir were accused of plotting against the empire. In response, Ottoman forces, often aided by Kurdish militias, attacked Armenian villages. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians were killed, their homes and businesses looted, and entire villages destroyed. Many survivors were left homeless, wandering in desperation. The international community condemned these atrocities. Countries like Britain, France, and Russia demanded that the Ottoman government protect Armenians. However, no significant action was taken to stop the violence. This lack of intervention sent a clear message to the Ottoman rulers. The world would not hold them accountable for targeting Armenians. A few years later, in 1909, violence erupted again, with the Adana massacres in the Cilicia region, particularly in the city of Adana. At this time, the Ottoman government was going through political upheaval. The Young Turks, who had come to power promising reform and equality, were being challenged by factions loyal to Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Amid this chaos, Armenians were falsely accused of siding with the opposition and plotting to overthrow the government. This triggered a brutal wave of violence in which Ottoman soldiers and local mobs attacked Armenian neighborhoods. Over 20,000 Armenians were killed, including women and children. Entire communities were wiped out in just a few days. The Adana massacre demonstrated how deeply rooted the hatred against Armenians had become. Once again, the international community voiced outrage, but no meaningful action was taken. This inaction emboldened those who saw violence against Armenians as acceptable. In 1908, the Committee of Union and Progress, commonly called the Young Turks, seized power in a coup. Initially, they promised to create a modern and inclusive empire where all ethnic and religious groups would have equal rights. Armenians, like other minorities, hoped this would bring an end to their suffering. However, the CUP's vision of reform soon shifted toward extreme nationalism. Leaders like Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha believed that the only way to save the Ottoman Empire was to Turkify it. This meant creating a state where Turkish identity, culture, and Islam were dominant, leaving no room for ethnic or religious diversity. Armenians, with their distinct Christian faith and close ties to foreign powers like Russia, were seen as a threat to this vision. The CUP leaders began to view Armenians as obstacles to their plans for a strong, unified Turkish state. This shift in ideology set the stage for more systematic violence. The year 1915 marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Armenian history. The genocide did not happen suddenly. It was the result of years of rising tensions. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was in steep decline, earning it the nickname Sick Man of Europe. Years of military defeats, economic mismanagement, and political instability had eroded its power and territorial holdings. The loss of territories in the Balkan Wars, where the empire relinquished large parts of southeastern Europe, further diminished its standing. The empire faced growing nationalist movements among its diverse population, with various ethnic groups seeking autonomy or independence. Desperate to reverse its fortunes, the Ottoman Empire joined Germany and Austria-Hungary in World War I, forming the Central Powers. The alliance offered the Ottomans military and economic support, as well as hopes of regaining lost territories. However, the decision thrust the empire into a conflict it was ill-prepared to manage. Fighting broke out on multiple fronts, stretching the empire's limited resources. In the east, Russia, a long-standing rival, emerged as a particularly fierce adversary. The Ottomans suffered major defeats, and Russian forces advanced into Ottoman-controlled regions near the border. Amid this turmoil, the Armenian population in the eastern provinces became a convenient scapegoat. The Ottomans accused Armenians of collaborating with Russia, citing the fact that a small number of Armenians from Russian-controlled eastern Armenia had joined Russian forces. And while these individuals sought liberation from Ottoman oppression, their actions were exaggerated and used as justification for widespread accusations of disloyalty. Ottoman authorities portrayed the entire Armenian population as a threat to national security, ignoring the loyalty of the vast majority. This narrative painted Armenians as traitors and spies, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that would soon lead to devastating consequences. The violence escalated in April 1915 with the siege of Van, a city in eastern Anatolia that was home to a large Armenian population and had long been a site of tension between Armenians and Ottoman authorities. As part of their broader campaign against Armenians, Ottoman forces began attacking villages in the Van region, massacring thousands of residents. Entire communities were just wiped out, and their homes were looted and burned. This violence created widespread panic among Armenians who feared they would be next. In Van itself, Armenians took drastic measures to defend themselves. Lacking military training and armed with limited resources, they barricaded their neighborhoods and organized a resistance. The city's Armenian population held off Ottoman forces for nearly a month, fighting desperately to protect their families and homes. The siege ended when Russian troops arrived, pushing Ottoman forces back. However, the victory came at an immense cost. By the time the fighting stopped, the countryside around Van had been devastated, with over 55,000 Armenians killed. For the Ottoman government, the Armenian defense of Van became a powerful propaganda tool. They labeled the resistance a rebellion, using it as evidence that Armenians were disloyal and plotting against the empire. This narrative further fueled anti-Armenian sentiment and justified the broader campaign of extermination that was already underway. As the siege of Van unfolded, the Ottoman government moved to eliminate what it saw as the Armenian problem. On April 24, 1915, authorities in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, carried out mass arrests of over 200 Armenian intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders. These individuals were among the most prominent members of the Armenian community, including writers, politicians, educators, and religious leaders. They were charged with conspiring against the government, a baseless accusation intended to justify their removal. The arrested Armenians were either executed outright or deported to remote locations where they died in prison camps. This decapitation of Armenian leadership left the community defenseless, unable to organize or advocate for itself in the face of escalating violence. The arrests on April 24th marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to annihilate the Armenian population. This date is now commemorated annually as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, honoring the victims and serving as a reminder of the atrocities that began that year. By silencing the voices of its Armenian intellectuals and leaders, the Ottoman government ensured that the broader population would be unable to resist the horrors that followed. including mass deportations, death marches, and systematic killings. The events of April 24, 1915 were not just an assault on individuals, but an attack on Armenian culture, identity, and history. In May 1915, the Ottoman government passed the Temporary Law of Deportation, which gave them legal authority to forcibly remove Armenians from their homes. This law was presented as a wartime necessity, claiming that Armenians needed to be relocated to prevent further rebellion. In reality, the deportations were part of a deliberate plan to destroy the Armenian population. The genocide is remembered not only for the staggering number of lives lost, but also for the unspeakable cruelty inflicted on the victims. One of the most horrific aspects of the genocide was the death marches. Armenian families, whole families, were forced to leave their homes and march hundreds of miles into the Syrian desert under the guise of relocation. And these marches were deliberately designed to be fatal. Extreme heat and exposure to the elements caused many to die of starvation, dehydration, and disease. Pregnant women, the elderly, and young children were particularly vulnerable and often collapsed along the way. To add to their suffering, paramilitary groups and local bandits frequently attacked the marchers. Survivors described scenes of unimaginable cruelty, including women being abducted and men executed on the spot. The Ottoman government organized large-scale massacres at key locations to accelerate the extermination process. One infamous site was Kama Gorge, where tens of thousands of Armenians were executed. Victims were often lined up and shot in groups or driven into rivers and drowned. In some cases, they were burned alive or killed with blunt weapons to conserve ammunition. Men were frequently forced to dig their own graves before being executed, a practice designed to dehumanize them and minimize costs. The killings were carried out by a combination of Ottoman soldiers, paramilitary groups like the Special Organization, and local mobs incited to violence. Women and children bore a unique and horrific burden during the genocide. Sexual violence was widespread, with countless women and girls being raped, abducted, or sold into slavery. Survivors recounted harrowing stories of being dragged away from their families, often never to return. Many women were forcibly converted to Islam and married into Turkish households, while children were taken in by Turkish families or state-run orphanages, where they were stripped of their Armenian names and identities. This deliberate erasure of Armenian culture and heritage extended beyond the immediate killings, aiming to assimilate survivors and destroy their sense of identity. The Ottoman government seized the homes, businesses, and lands of Armenians, redistributing them to Turkish citizens or government officials. This process not only enriched those complicit in the genocide, but also erased the Armenian presence from these regions. Churches, schools, and other cultural landmarks were destroyed or converted into mosques or warehouses. Artifacts, manuscripts, and other elements of Armenian heritage and history were looted or destroyed to erase the memory of the Armenian people. The genocide left a profound and lasting impact, not only on the Armenian people, but also on global history. By the time the genocide ended in the early 1920s, the Armenian population within the Ottoman Empire had been almost entirely annihilated. By 1923, an estimated 1.1 million Armenians had been killed, roughly two-thirds of the Ottoman Empire's Armenian population. Entire villages, towns, and communities that had existed for centuries were wiped out. The survivors, traumatized and destitute, fled to various parts of the world, forming the Armenian diaspora. Diaspora communities emerged in countries like the United States, France, Russia, Lebanon, and Syria, where survivors rebuilt their lives. In many cases, these refugees carried little more than their memories and the determination to preserve their culture. For the Armenian people, the genocide was not only a loss of life, but also a loss of homeland, heritage, and identity. The historical heartland of Armenia in the Ottoman Empire was effectively erased, leaving behind ruins and unmarked graves. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, the Ottoman Empire's collapse led to the establishment of the Turkish national movement under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The post-war Ottoman government, under Allied pressure, organized trials to hold key figures accountable for the genocide. Some officials, including members of the CUP, were tried and sentenced in absentia. However, these trials were largely symbolic and most of the accused, including Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, fled to Europe or Central Asia to escape punishment. Efforts to bring justice were further undermined when the new Turkish Republic, established in 1923, refused to recognize these trials or the genocide itself. Frustrated by the lack of justice, Armenian survivors took matters into their own hands through Operation Nemesis, a secret operation carried out by the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. The operation targeted key figures responsible for orchestrating the genocide. In 1921, Talat Pasha, the chief architect of the genocide, was assassinated in Berlin by Sogomon Tehlirian, an Armenian survivor. Tehlirian was acquitted in a widely publicized trial where he testified about the horrors he had witnessed during the genocide. Operation Nemesis became a symbol of retribution and a reminder that Armenian people would not forget the atrocities committed against them. The genocide remains a deeply polarizing issue, with starkly opposing narratives. Successive Turkish governments have denied that the events constitute genocide. They argue that Armenians were involved in rebellions and that deaths occurred on both sides. Despite Turkish denial, over 30 countries and many international organizations, including the United Nations, European Parliament, and the Catholic Church, have officially recognized the Armenian genocide. Turkey's refusal to acknowledge the genocide has caused significant tension, particularly with Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. Attempts at reconciliation have repeatedly failed due to this unresolved historical grievance. The legacy of the genocide continues to strain relations between Armenia and Turkey. In 2009, the two countries attempted to normalize relations by signing protocols to establish diplomatic ties and open their border. However, the process collapsed, largely due to disagreements over the genocide's recognition. For many Armenians, Turkey's denial remains the primary obstacle for reconciliation. While the overwhelming majority of scholars and historians recognize this tragic event as a genocide, denialist arguments persist, particularly from the Turkish government and some nationalist groups. This debate is not merely academic, it has profound political, social, and cultural implications. Denialists assert that the deaths of Armenians during World War I were not the result of a planned extermination, but were instead casualties of war, rebellion, or poor conditions. They claim Armenians rebelled against the Ottoman Empire and collaborated with its wartime enemy Russia. Based on this narrative, Ottoman officials justified the deportations as a necessary security measure to quell internal rebellion. Denialists argue that many Armenians died from famine, disease, and exposure, common hardships in war zones, rather than the deliberate killings. They frame the events as part of the broader collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which saw suffering among multiple ethnic groups. A central claim is the absence of explicit orders for extermination, suggesting there was no coordinated plan for it. These arguments have been propagated through official Turkish narratives, lobbying efforts, and some sympathetic historians. However, these claims are increasingly undermined by a wealth of evidence. The historical record overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that Armenian genocide was a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing. Evidence comes from a variety of sources. Official orders and correspondence show intent to target Armenians. While some orders used euphemistic language like deportation, their implementation revealed their true purpose. Testimonies from Ottoman officials themselves, such as statements by General Vahid Pasha, described the massacres as deliberate acts. Thousands of survivors recounted the systematic deportations, massacres, and brutal treatment. Their accounts are consistent across regions and corroborate evidence of intent. Ambassadors and missionaries stationed in the Ottoman Empire, such as Henry Morgenthau Sr., the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, documented the atrocities. Morgenthau famously referred to the events as a campaign of race extermination. Historians worldwide agree that the Armenian genocide fits the definition of genocide as defined by international law. Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide in 1944, explicitly cited the Armenian genocide as a key example when developing the concept. The United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide outlines criteria for genocide that align closely with the Armenian case, which is the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, in whole or in part. Academic studies have consistently refuted denialist claims. Major historians like Taner Akşam, Richard Hovhannissian, and Donald Bloxham provide extensive documentation proving the genocidal intent of the Ottoman leadership, particularly the CUP. For Armenians, the genocide represents a profound tragedy and an unresolved injustice.